It's about to get real up in here. About to get real. Decent amount of bubbles in there, but gosh, look how pretty that looks.
As a woodworker, I try to live by 3 important rules when starting a new project that I may not have a lot of experience with. Rule 1, planning and preparation can only take you so far. I have a bad habit of thinking through project details in my head for months before ever taking a single cut. I mean, eventually you just have to dive in. For example, I have been thinking for years of taking this pile of walnut, oak, and maple slats and turning it into a modified epoxy river desk for my office. However, to make the desk of my dreams, it's not going to require just 1 gallon of epoxy, but more, 4 to 5 gallons of epoxy. And let me tell you, epoxy's not cheap. This represents a little over $400 worth in epoxy, and it doesn't even take into account all the extras that I have planned for this desk. This leads me into rule number 2. Rule number 2. If you're going to build something that requires a sizable investment, I like to actually build a scaled down version of that project, or at least something similar that's going to show me the same techniques or the same style in that build. Which leads me back to this pile of wood. Instead of using this entire stack of wood and all of my epoxy immediately and making the office desk, what I'm going to use is a fraction of it and a fraction of the epoxy to make a beautiful and one-of-a-kind looking epoxy cutting board. This way, as Bob Ross would put it, if and when I do have a happy accident, I can learn from my mistakes without devastating my wallet. It's going to also give me the much needed experience, so that way when I tackle the big project like the desk, I'm going to make a lot less or hopefully no happy accidents. And plus, now I have 2 new cool projects instead of just 1. And all of this leads into then rule number 3, which is the right tool will not only save you time, but in the long run, it's probably going to save you money as well. Bubbles are the enemy of epoxy pours. So I did invest in a vacuum chamber to help mitigate the potential for bubbles in the pour. It's going to give me a better final product and not a bubbly waste of hundreds of dollars. I also purchased a few smaller tools to help make my life easier, but I'm going to go ahead and wait to show you those until we get further into this video. At least that's the idea. If you live by these 3 rules, then your odds of having a successful project done in a timely manner are going to go way up. But with that, let's get into making one cool looking epoxy cutting board.
Making a cutting board is a relatively easy and straightforward process that I would encourage any hobbyist woodworker to try. Variations of cutting boards are really limited only to your imagination. In my case, I'm using primarily oak and walnut to create a stepped look that's going to include epoxy on both ends. I'm also choosing to make a long grain, or also known as an edge grade cutting board, to mirror the style that I'm going to be using for my desk. Long grain is different than an end grain cutting board, where instead of cutting on the length of the grain, each piece of wood is set vertically so that the cut is on the end of the wood. Just think of a butcher block table when you think of end grain cutting boards. For durability and use, end grain cutting boards are far superior for heavy use and easier on your knife blade as well. The trade-off for that durability is that they do require slightly more oiling and upkeep. However, if your cutting board is only going to be used occasionally or maybe just for display, a long grain cutting board is going to be just fine. One important thing to note is if you are using epoxy for your cutting boards, the epoxy surface itself is not an ideal surface to cut on. It will damage easier and isn't something that you can just throw some food grade mineral oil on it to repair it.
I'm gonna try using release tape. Maybe this will work better than wax. We'll see.
Ultimately, my best advice is just to understand the type of application and level of use your cutting board is going to receive before determining what type of board to make. As I said earlier, this particular board I'm making is more for experimentation, decoration, and learning, so I'm more than happy with a long grain board that uses epoxy at both ends.
Ta-da!
All right, well, we are officially into uncharted territory. This is not a how-to. This is an experimentation to figure out what method I like best and what will yield the best results. So epoxy has a bad habit of finding any little crevice and leaking out everywhere, which is something that I do not want. I'm gonna take the extra step and put in a bead of silicone caulking. I also, if you ever watch Modustrial Maker, it's a great YouTube channel. He uses little fondant ball rollers to give him a perfect bead of caulking on every single seam. So I spent like $6 on Amazon and got myself these bad boys. So I'm gonna experiment with these as well. Hopefully that will make a nice, perfect line of caulking. So should we experiment and find out? That actually worked pretty nifty. So now we just let it dry, peel off the excess, and we'll be ready to pour some epoxy.
The next day.
I will say that this fondant roller did a pretty nice job. And because I laid the tape first, oh, that's super satisfying. Look at that. That excessive bit of silicone caulk comes right off.
A few moments later.
There we go. That was oddly satisfying. I will tell you that this is a win. If you are doing this, hey, a couple things to note. One, make sure you're using 100% silicone caulking, which I did, worked really well. But two, I'm used to laying down a real thin bead of caulking when I do stuff like this. It actually was easier in the spots where I laid down a thicker bead of caulking, because what this does is it just creates a separation between the two. So I'm left with a really fine line, and if I had a thick piece of leftover, it pulled off real easy. I'm glad that I did this. This was a good little experimentation. 10 out of 10. Well, after a whole lot of prep work, I am finally ready to pour. The table itself wasn't perfectly level. It was really close. So what I decided to do was have an additional board and put in little leveling feet on it. That way it was able to give me some micro adjustments, because when you are leveling this epoxy, you definitely want it level on both axes, which now it is. So that's a really good thing. But yeah, there's literally nothing left to do but go ahead and break out my new toy, mix up some epoxy, and see if I can pull this project off.
It's about to get real up in here. Decent amount of bubbles in there, but gosh, look how pretty that looks. Now, the vacuum chamber.
One eternity later.
Okay, so I planed it down real quick. Don't know if that's the best thing for my my planer blades. I got it down to what I believe will be the final size. Overall, pretty happy. I will tell you the biggest mistake that I've made so far though is that I just simply didn't use enough resin. Even though I thought I had it tight on the bottom and I had weight on it and everything, resin still made it underneath, and because of that it settles and then basically went down lower than I had hoped. So this board is about 1/8 of an inch thinner than I was originally hoping for. If I was doing a final board product, I would really want this to be at least 1 inch thick, and it's probably 7/8. The epoxy cured for 3 days. So this had a full 72 hours, and I will tell you it is not perfectly hard yet, so it'll probably use another day. But at this point, I'm just gonna play around with it, try and sand it up, trying to experiment a little bit with finishes to see what I like and to bring this project home and finish it up in style.
Now that the board is planed to size, I started the initial finish work by dry sanding with a 220 and then a 320 grit sandpaper. Once I felt like the big scratches in the board were addressed, I decided to round the corners of the board as well as round over the top and bottom edges with a 1/8 inch round over bit. Even though the overall design may be meant to be a bit blocky, I felt like softening the edges not only looked better, but felt better to hold as well. With that, it was time to put the finishing touches on this project. I started with a layer of food-grade mineral oil and beeswax mixture for the wood. Basically, it's just a little beeswax melted into the mineral oil to give it an extra layer of protection. Once the main portion of the board was protected, I wanted to experiment with finishes on the epoxy itself. Job 1 was to work the resin down to a glass finish by first dry sanding up to a 600 grit and then wet sanding all the way up to a 5000 grit. Once this was complete, I decided to experiment with buffing and finishing compound that I actually found at AutoZone. Yes, I'm fully aware of the countless buffing and polishing compounds specially formulated for epoxy that can be found on Amazon. However, I wanted to see if I could get similar results using cheaper yet equally effective products. Feel free to disagree with me in the comments on this one. Note this Powerball sponge attachment, it went on your drill and it worked average at best. I actually found this bad boy at AutoZone as well. It was fun to use, but overall gave me mixed results. I imagine though it could be pretty good working on much larger surfaces. And with that last bit of polishing, I think it's finally time to take a look at the finished product.
Well, I'm happy to say mission accomplished. By scaling down, I was really able to learn a lot about not only how I wanted to do epoxy pours, but how the epoxy would work with the wood that I wanted to use, as well as come up with a really cool project in the process that I can not only make, but I could totally replicate and scale up and sell. If you've been watching this video because you're thinking about maybe not only making cutting boards, but selling them, let me take just a quick second to do a cost breakdown for you. As far as materials are concerned, this is not a cheap cutting board. There is probably about $5 to maybe $7 worth in wood and probably about $15 to $20 worth in epoxy. You got to think the epoxy itself breaks down to around 50 cents an ounce, give or take, and there was about 32 ounces used in this pour. In addition, I did go ahead and put on some rubber feet to make it look better, and you have the other peripherals as far as cost goes, as far as waste of other wood for building a frame, and tools and tapes and things that you may need. So if I had to break down just from a pure at cost standpoint for something like this, I would say you're probably looking at around $30, maybe $35, $40 probably on the high end. That means if you're looking to sell something like this, I tend to use the rule of threes, where I take my base cost and I'm going to multiply it by 3, because that other 2/3, it really comes down to your cost and labor. So if I were to sell a board like this, bare bones, we're talking $100, but something like this is probably going to run more like $120, maybe $150 and up, depending on where you're selling it and what kind of retail you're looking at. Just certainly things you want to consider. As far as the building and the finishing went, just a couple final notes on these. I did not love the buffing compound. If I were to do it again, I would tell you, if you were gonna use a buffing compound, it's something that you're talking about at the 600 grit to 800 grit process, not when you're talking 2,000 or 5,000. At that point, it's just polishing, because anything other than polishing is gonna leave micro scratches in the epoxy. Finally, as far as like what is a hard project to build, it really isn't. It is a project that definitely is going to take you some time. There's a process involved. Start to finish, I would say probably about a week of build time goes into this. Either or, hopefully it kind of gives you a little bit of a better idea. It certainly did for me, about what it takes not only to do a project like this, but what it will also take for me to build and scale up this into something like an office desk. And speaking of an office desk, I do hope that you stay tuned to this channel for the next couple months, because that is the next big project I'm gonna tackle. But until then, like I say, I'm just happy I have a nice new cutting board to mess around with and play with. Just happy to have another project that I could show you, hopefully that you can replicate and build yourself. But with that, hey, thanks for coming along, and I'll see you on the next one.